The worst thing about family secrets is that the house always knows before the people do. Harrison said that the moment he stepped back into Blackthorn House after 12 years away, and nobody at the dining table looked surprised enough. Rain pressed softly against the towering windows while the chandeliers reflected gold light across the long oak table that had belonged to the Harrison family for almost a century. The room smelled faintly of fireplace smoke, expensive wine, and old wood polished too many times to hide its age. Isabel stood beside David with a crystal bottle of red wine in her hand, elegant, as always, in cream silk and diamonds that caught the light whenever she moved. She smiled carefully, but her fingers tightened around the bottle the second Harrison entered the room, wearing that faded denim jacket like he didn't belong among any of them. Ethan noticed it immediately. At 24, he had spent most of his life watching people in this family avoid saying what they actually meant, and tonight felt different somehow. Too quiet, too rehearsed. Harrison walked slowly toward the far end of the table, boots echoing softly across the hardwood floor while James, the family's longtime butler, silently closed the dining room doors behind him. Nobody touched their food. Nobody even pretended to. Eleanor sat beneath the chandelier with both hands wrapped around a teacup she hadn't lifted once. Her silver curls framed a face that suddenly looked older than Ethan remembered, and every time Harrison glanced in her direction, she lowered her eyes toward the untouched plate in front of her. David loosened his tie slightly, exhausted before the dinner had even started, while Victoria remained perfectly still beside the fireplace, watching Harrison with the same cold expression she used during funerals. "You came back without warning," Isabel finally said with a soft laugh that sounded too polished to be real. Harrison pulled out the chair at the end of the table, the one nobody had used in years. "So did the truth," he replied calmly. Silence spread through the room again. Ethan looked around slowly, realizing nobody seemed confused by what Harrison meant. That was the moment he understood something terrifying. This family wasn't afraid of Harrison returning. They were afraid of what he remembered. Outside, thunder rolled somewhere beyond the hills surrounding the estate, while Harrison reached for the glass James had quietly placed beside him. He took a slow sip of whiskey, then looked directly at Eleanor for the first time that evening. "Tell me," he said quietly, "does the house still keep the same locked room upstairs?" Eleanor's hand trembled so slightly most people would have missed it. Ethan didn't. Nobody spoke after Harrison asked about the locked room upstairs. The rain outside grew heavier, tapping against the tall windows in uneven rhythms, while the fire crackled softly near Victoria's chair. Ethan looked from face to face, waiting for someone to answer, but the silence around the table felt almost rehearsed, as if they had all practiced avoiding certain subjects years ago. Eleanor finally lifted her teacup with trembling fingers, though she still could not meet Harrison's eyes. "That room has been closed for decades," she said quietly. "There is nothing left in it now." Harrison leaned back slightly in his chair and stared into the amber whiskey inside his glass. "That is interesting," he replied calmly, "because some things survive longer than people expect." Isabel immediately stepped forward before Eleanor could respond again. "We should eat before dinner gets cold," she said with a graceful smile that looked perfect from a distance but strained up close. She began serving roast beef onto porcelain plates while James moved silently around the table filling water glasses. Ethan noticed something strange then. James never looked nervous around anyone in the family, but tonight he avoided standing behind Harrison for too long. Almost like being near him made him uncomfortable. David finally cleared his throat and forced a tired smile toward Ethan. "How is law school going?" he asked. The question sounded unnatural, dropped into the room like a desperate distraction. Ethan answered automatically, but his attention remained fixed on Harrison, who seemed completely uninterested in the conversation around him. Instead, Harrison's eyes wandered slowly across the dining room walls where generations of Harrison family portraits hung beneath dim golden lighting. Old oil paintings, men in military uniforms, women wearing pearls and stiff expressions. A family built on money, reputation, and silence. "One portrait is missing," Harrison said suddenly. Isabel froze for half a second while placing down the wine bottle. Ethan caught it immediately. So did Sophia, who had arrived late and now sat quietly near the center of the table observing everyone with sharp attention behind calm eyes. The portrait was damaged during storage, Isabel answered smoothly. We had it removed last winter. Harrison gave a faint nod, but the corner of his mouth almost lifted into a smile. Of course you did. Ethan could feel tension tightening across the room like invisible wire. Even the chandelier above them seemed to hum softly in the silence. Then Eleanor pushed her chair back slightly and stood up too quickly. I am tired, she whispered. I think I should rest. Before anyone could respond, Harrison spoke again without raising his voice. Did you ever tell him the truth, Eleanor? The question stopped her completely. Ethan watched his grandmother grip the back of her chair so tightly her knuckles turned pale. For several seconds nobody moved. Then Eleanor turned slowly toward Harrison with eyes full of something Ethan had never seen before. Fear. Eleanor did not answer Harrison immediately. She simply stood there beside the table with one hand gripping the chair while thunder rolled somewhere beyond the hills surrounding Blackthorn House. Ethan noticed how pale she looked beneath the chandelier light, almost fragile compared to the woman who usually controlled every family gathering with quiet precision. Victoria finally broke the silence first. This is unnecessary, she said coldly from beside the fireplace. We invited everyone here for dinner, not another one of Harrison's games. Harrison slowly turned his head toward her without changing expression. You always confuse truth with games, he replied. Isabel stepped in before Victoria could respond. Again, Eleanor is tired, she said firmly. We should continue this conversation another time. But Harrison did not look at Isabel. His eyes remained fixed on Eleanor. You promised someone you would tell him eventually, he said quietly. Do you still remember that night? Ethan felt the air leave the room. Nobody asked what night Harrison meant. That was the worst part. Nobody looked confused. Sophia sat very still beside Ethan, her fingers resting near her untouched wine glass while she observed every reaction around the table like a courtroom attorney watching witnesses unravel under pressure. David suddenly stood up from his chair and walked toward the window, loosening his tie again with shaky hands. I do not understand why we are doing this tonight, he muttered. After 12 years, you walk back into this house and start reopening old stories nobody wants to hear. Harrison finally looked at him then. There was something strange in his expression. Not anger, not resentment, almost disappointment. Some stories stay buried because people are ashamed, Harrison said calmly. Others stay buried because powerful people worked very hard to keep them there. Ethan saw James pause briefly while pouring water near Victoria's chair. The old butler lowered his eyes immediately afterward, but not before Ethan caught the reaction. James knew something too. The realization settled heavily in Ethan's chest. This was not one family secret. This was an entire house built around one. Eleanor slowly sat back down again, moving carefully like someone carrying invisible weight across her shoulders. Please stop, she whispered. Harrison rested both hands on the oak table and leaned forward slightly for the first time that evening. I would have stopped years ago if the lies had only destroyed me, he said. Isabel's composure cracked for barely a second. Ethan noticed her glance toward the staircase near the far hallway. It happened quickly, but Harrison noticed it too. His eyes followed hers toward the dark upper floor of the mansion where the locked room still waited behind decades of silence. Then Harrison smiled faintly into his whiskey glass and said the words. That made Ethan's stomach tighten. Interesting. So nobody checked whether the key was still missing. Ethan could not stop thinking about the missing key after dinner finally ended. The family scattered through Blackthorn House like strangers escaping the same storm. Victoria disappeared into the west hallway without saying goodnight to anyone. Isabel walked upstairs beside David with one hand resting lightly against his arm, whispering something too low for Ethan to hear. Eleanor had locked herself inside her bedroom almost immediately, and Harrison remained alone near the dying fireplace, staring into the flames with the patience of someone who had already waited years for the truth to rise on its own. Near midnight, Ethan stood outside the second-floor hallway where the locked room sat hidden behind dark walnut doors at the far end. The mansion felt different at night, older somehow. Every floorboard creaked softly beneath his steps, while rainwater slid down the tall windows overlooking the empty grounds outside. Portraits of dead relatives watched from the walls beneath dim amber lights, their expressions cold and distant. Ethan had passed this hallway hundreds of times growing up, but tonight was the first time he realized how deliberately everyone avoided it. You should not be up here alone. Ethan turned quickly and found James standing near the staircase holding a silver tray with untouched glasses still resting on top. The old butler looked tired in a way Ethan had never noticed before. "What is inside that room?" Ethan asked quietly. James hesitated for several seconds before answering. The wrong question in this family is usually the dangerous one. Ethan glanced back toward the locked door. Harrison said the key was missing. James lowered his eyes briefly. It disappeared the same night he left this house. The words settled heavily between them. Ethan stepped closer. "Why did he leave?" James gave a faint, humorless smile. "Because some people survive betrayal better when they disappear before the house finishes swallowing them." Before Ethan could ask another question, footsteps echoed softly from downstairs. James immediately straightened. His posture. "Go back to your room, Mr. Ethan." But Ethan stayed where he was as Harrison slowly emerged from the shadows near the staircase below. He still wore the same denim jacket from dinner, his silver hair slightly damp from stepping outside earlier into the rain. Harrison looked up toward the hallway and saw both of them standing there. "You always did ask questions too early," he said calmly to Ethan. Ethan crossed his arms. "And nobody here ever answers them." Harrison climbed the staircase slowly until he stood directly in front of the locked room. For several seconds, he simply stared at the door without touching it. Then he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and removed a small brass key worn smooth with age. Ethan felt his heartbeat quicken instantly. James closed his eyes briefly like a man watching an old nightmare return. Harrison held the key between his fingers beneath the dim hallway light and said quietly, "The problem with lies is that eventually someone forgets who they were protecting." Harrison did not unlock the door immediately. He simply stood there beneath the dim hallway lights holding the brass key between his fingers while rain continued tapping softly against the windows at the end of the corridor. Ethan watched him carefully, trying to understand why a single old key seemed to frighten everyone in the house more than the truth itself. James remained silent beside the staircase, his face unreadable in the shadows. "If you had the key all these years," Ethan finally asked, "why come back now?" Harrison looked down at the worn metal in his hand before answering. "Because the wrong person started believing the lie belonged to them." The words hung heavily in the quiet hallway. Before Ethan could respond, a bedroom door opened further down the corridor. Isabel stepped out slowly wearing a cream cashmere robe over dark silk sleepwear, elegant even at midnight. She stopped the moment she saw Harrison standing in front of the locked room. For the first time since his return, Ethan saw genuine fear cross her face before she quickly covered it with composure. "You should not be up here," she said softly. Harrison slipped the key back into his pocket without looking away from the door. "Interesting," he replied calmly. "That is exactly what your mother told me the night everything changed." Isabel's expression hardened instantly. "My mother has nothing to do with this." Harrison finally turned toward her then. "That is the problem with old money families," he said quietly. "Everybody pretends the women are innocent while they quietly decide where the bodies of truth get buried." Ethan felt tension tighten again between them. Isabel crossed her arms carefully. "You disappeared for 12 years, and now you come back acting like some misunderstood victim." Harrison almost smiled at that. "No, Isabel. Victims beg to be believed. I came back because someone opened the wrong file." Ethan frowned slightly. "What file?" Neither Harrison nor Isabel answered him. Instead, Isabel looked briefly toward the locked room before speaking again. "You should leave the past alone." Harrison stepped closer to her, calm and unhurried. "If the past stayed buried, then why did Eleanor start drinking again after 20 years? Isabel said nothing. Ethan stared at her in shock because the silence itself sounded like confirmation. Downstairs, the grandfather clock echoed through the mansion, each chime stretching slowly through the empty halls of Blackthorn House. Harrison glanced once more toward the locked room. "Inside that room," he said quietly, "is the reason David was never supposed to inherit this house." Ethan felt the words hit like cold water. Before he could process what Harrison meant, another voice suddenly came from the darkness near the staircase below. "Then maybe it is time somebody finally tells the boy the truth." Thomas stepped into the hallway holding a leather folder tightly against his chest, while Eleanor stood silently behind him with tears already forming in her tired eyes. Ethan felt the hallway tilt around him after Harrison spoke those two words. "My son." The silence that followed seemed to drain warmth from the entire mansion. Rain continued sliding down the tall windows while the old chandelier above them hummed faintly, casting pale gold light across faces that suddenly looked older and far more exhausted than before. Ethan looked directly at David first. His uncle stood frozen near the wall, breathing unevenly while Isabel remained beside him with one hand lightly gripping his arm, as though she already knew he might collapse under the weight of what was coming next. "What do you mean your son vanished?" Ethan asked quietly. Harrison's eyes remained calm. "I mean exactly what I said." Victoria stepped forward before anyone else could speak. "There was no missing child," she said sharply. "There was a tragedy, and Harrison lost his grip on reality afterward." But Thomas shook his head slowly. "That is not true." Victoria turned toward him with visible anger for the first time all evening. "Be careful." Thomas removed another document from the folder with trembling hands. "The hospital records were altered 3 days after the fire," he said quietly. "I signed the revisions myself." Ethan stared at him in disbelief. "Altered how?" Eleanor suddenly covered her mouth with shaking fingers while tears slid freely down her cheeks. Harrison answered before Thomas could. "The child declared dead that night was never identified properly." Ethan felt cold spread through his chest. "Then whose child was it?" Nobody answered immediately because the answer itself seemed too dangerous to speak aloud. James finally broke the silence from near the staircase below. "There was another family staying on the east side of the property that winter," he said quietly. "Temporary staff. They left before sunrise the next morning." Ethan looked toward Harrison again. "And your son?" Harrison stared toward the locked room at the end of the hallway. "Gone." Isabel stepped in quickly. "This is insanity," she said firmly. "You are dragging old grief into the present because you cannot let go of the past." Harrison almost smiled at that. "No, Isabel. I returned because someone inside this house recently started searching for the original trust documents." Ethan immediately noticed how still she became after hearing those words. Too still. Sophia noticed it too. The young attorney had remained silent most of the night, but now she finally spoke. The trust was not only connected to inheritance, was it? Thomas slowly lowered the papers in his hands. No, Sophia folded her arms carefully. Then what was the real condition? Nobody moved. Then Harrison spoke softly into the silence. Blackthorn House could only pass to a direct blood heir. Ethan slowly turned toward David again. His uncle looked pale beneath the hallway lights now, as though he finally understood what everyone else had been hiding for years. Harrison's voice remained calm when he added the sentence that changed everything. "And somebody in this house has known for decades that David is not one." David looked like a man trying to remain standing inside a collapsing room. He leaned one hand against the hallway wall beneath the family portraits while Isabel stayed close beside him, her calm expression beginning to fracture beneath the pressure spreading through Blackthorn House. Ethan could barely process what Harrison had just revealed. Every memory he had of this family suddenly felt unstable, like photographs exposed to too much heat. "That is not possible," David said quietly. "You are lying." Harrison did not react to the accusation. "I spent 12 years waiting for someone else to tell you the truth first," he replied calmly. "Nobody did." Victoria stepped forward again, her voice sharp enough to cut through the hallway silence. "Enough of this." But Eleanor suddenly spoke before anyone else could interrupt again. "Stop." Everyone turned toward her in shock because Eleanor Harrison almost never raised her voice. She stood trembling near the staircase with tears still running down her face, while James remained frozen behind her like a witness too exhausted to keep carrying someone else's secrets. "He deserves to know," Eleanor whispered. Isabel shook her head immediately. "No. Telling him now will destroy everything." Harrison looked directly at her. Interesting choice of words. Ethan noticed Sophia quietly watching every reaction around the hallway, like she was piecing together a puzzle no court would ever fully untangle. Thomas slowly removed one final document from the folder in his hands and passed it toward David. "I kept copies," he said softly. David stared down at the yellowed paper beneath the dim chandelier light. Ethan stepped closer and caught fragments of names, dates, hospital records, and signatures written in fading blue ink. Then David suddenly looked up at Eleanor with devastation spreading across his face. "You knew?" Eleanor covered her mouth again, unable to answer immediately. Finally, she nodded once. Very small, very broken. David stepped backward like the movement itself hurt him. All these years, Victoria moved toward him quickly. David, listen to me carefully. Blood does not make a family. Harrison finally laughed softly for the first time that night, but there was no humor in it. That speech would sound far more convincing if you had not spent 30 years protecting inheritance lawyers and trust agreements. The silence afterward felt unbearable. Rain hammered harder against the windows now, while the old house groaned quietly around them. Ethan suddenly understood why Harrison had returned. This was never revenge. It was exposure. Isabel slowly turned toward the locked room at the end of the hallway, and Ethan noticed genuine panic in her eyes now. Harrison noticed it too. You finally realized what is inside there, did you not? He asked quietly. Isabel swallowed hard, but said nothing. Harrison stepped toward the locked door once more and removed the brass key from his pocket again. The records hidden upstairs do not only prove who inherited this house, he said calmly. They prove who stole it. The hallway remained silent as Harrison stepped toward the locked room with the brass key resting in his hand. Nobody tried to stop him this time. Even Victoria stood motionless near the staircase, her cold composure finally beginning to crack beneath the weight of truths that had survived inside Blackthorn House for decades. Ethan watched Harrison slide the key into the old lock with slow, deliberate movement. The metal clicked softly through the hallway like the sound of something ancient finally surrendering. Then the door opened. Dust floated through the dim air beyond the doorway while the smell of old paper, cedar wood, and forgotten years drifted out into the hall. The room itself looked untouched by time. Shelves lined the walls from floor to ceiling filled with leather ledgers, framed photographs, and sealed storage boxes marked with dates stretching back generations. A single lamp still sat beside an old desk near the window overlooking the dark grounds outside. Harrison stepped inside first without speaking. Ethan followed carefully while Sophia and Thomas entered behind him. Isabel remained frozen outside the doorway, unable to move closer. On the far wall hung a portrait covered by a white cloth yellowed with age. Harrison stopped in front of it for several seconds before pulling the fabric away. Ethan stared in shock at the painting underneath. The boy in the portrait could not have been older than 10, dressed in dark formal clothing with silver-gray eyes that looked hauntingly familiar. Harrison glanced toward Ethan quietly. My son, Benjamin Harrison. Ethan slowly turned toward David, standing near the doorway. The resemblance between them was impossible to ignore now. Not identical, but close enough to understand why the family had spent decades protecting the lie. Eleanor lowered herself into a nearby chair with trembling hands while tears continued sliding silently down her face. Thomas opened one of the storage boxes and removed sealed hospital records, trust agreements, photographs, and birth certificates. Everything was kept here, he said quietly. The original records, the amendments, the proof. Sophia carefully examined several documents beneath the lamplight before looking toward Ethan. The succession trust was never legally transferred, she said softly, which means Blackthorn House technically still belongs to Harrison's bloodline. David looked down at the floor, shattered by the realization that his entire life had been built on someone else's identity. Harrison approached him slowly, but there was no anger in his face now, only exhaustion. None of this was your fault, he said quietly. David looked up with tears in his eyes. Then why tell me now? Harrison glanced around the room, filled with decades of silence and secrets. Because lies grow heavier with age. Outside, the storm had finally begun to fade. Morning light slowly appeared through the windows beyond the hills surrounding the estate, while Blackthorn House stood quieter than Ethan had ever known it. Harrison placed the brass key gently on the old desk and looked once more at the portrait of the son he lost years ago. Families like ours do not collapse because of hatred, he said softly. They collapse because nobody tells the truth until the house can no longer hold it.